We are official.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I can hear muffled.
Yes. Sorry, we are official.
We're official. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Tonight is the kickoff meeting of our new town visioning work sessions. We're so glad that so many of you were able to come. We have members of the CA Board of Directors, we have village representatives, and we have some of CA's senior staff here with us tonight. CA is entering what could be seen as its next phase of life, having recently passed its 50-year anniversary. It's time to look forward and imagine what the future holds as a planned community. The intent of the work sessions is to provide the CA Board of Directors with some opportunities for reflection and visioning with examples of other master planned communities which have gone through similar phases and established best practices. So using these points of comparison, we can consider what CA and Columbia are doing well and what could be modified in the future. What are our priorities and how do we get there? So these are the things that we're going to be talking about over the course of the next few months with the guidance of our consultants. We welcome the villages to join us in this learning process. We're all part of the same team and we are all striving to make Columbia great. By the end of this series of workshops, we hope to establish a collective agreement on what our priorities are so that we can collectively and effectively advocate for them going forward. The consultants leading these workshops come from across the country. We just heard somebody commenting on the weather in California with both real world practice and academic expertise. And I trust that their experience will help us see Columbia in new ways. And their questions and suggestions will facilitate valuable discussions among us. Before I let the consultants introduce themselves, I just have two housekeeping items related to Zoom. First, if you're not talking, please mute yourself in order to eliminate background noise. And second, if you wish to speak, at the bottom of your screen, you should see, it says participants. And if you click there, you'll see a list of everybody in the room. And at the bottom of that list, there is a button that says raise hand. And we do have somebody monitoring that. And if you virtually raise your hand, we'll know that you wish to comment. If that doesn't work for you, kind of just wave frantically at the screen and we'll catch your eye and that'll work as well. So with that being said, I want to hand things off to our team and they can give brief introductions about themselves. You can see their brief resumes on the screen right now, but it will be good to hear it straight from them. Now, Tom, do you want me to have the attendees introduce themselves first?
Why don't we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves and then I'll pull up that list and we can have them in.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Kristen, and thank you everyone for showing up, and we're looking forward to these discussions, and we appreciate everyone being here on time. We have a lot of information to share and discuss, and a lot put into a 2-hour session. So before we get into the introductions, I'm Tom McGilloway from Mahan Reichel here in Baltimore, and I wanted to just reiterate the housekeeping tips of putting your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. You know, we all wish we could be there in person with you, but this is part of our new reality. So we'll make this as painless as possible. We're going to do a break about halfway, about 8:10 or 8 o'clock, 8:10, 5-minute break. So just keep that in mind. We're going to be doing a series of presentation, then some discussion, and then some more presentation and some discussion. So it'll be broken up a bit. We really appreciate everyone submitting their survey responses. I think we shared a copy with you. We're not going to spend a lot of time going through that tonight, but we did pull out a couple of the items to inform some of the discussion and to put it up into our presentation and show that in context with some of the data and the trends that we've been sharing. So with that, again, I'm Tom McGilloway from Mahan Reichel in Baltimore, an urban designer and planner. I'm the project manager for this effort. It's really a privilege for me to be leading this team of really a group of experts here on master plan communities in Columbia. I live in Baltimore now. I lived in Columbia when I first moved to Maryland, and I worked in Columbia for 17 years. So this is really a pleasure to be working on this opportunity here. I just managed the Ellicott City Master Plan, which is currently online now for public comment as well. So it's fun to be working close to home. So I'm going to turn it over. Our team members can just introduce themselves in the order that they appear. Actually, before I turn it over to you, Steve, I want to introduce Erin Talkington. She's not here tonight. She'll be at our next two workshops. She's with RCLCO marketing, and she's currently working on the housing study, has extensive experience and market-related work in Columbia and Howard County. So she'll be joining our next couple sessions. Steve.
Steve Kellenberg. I'm the one farthest away. Somehow they found me, and I think partly because I've done a lot of work on master plan communities. I've worked on a number of books, but more importantly, I've actually been the planner on 30 or 40 master plan communities over my career, and I learned sort of what works and what doesn't work. And I'm currently engaged in a number of them around the country, and so kind of have my pulse a little bit on what's going on. I'm honored to be a part of this because Columbia has always been one of the what we call the classics, which initiated the the master plan community movement in the 1960s, and so to be asked to be a part of this, I'm really excited about it and happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Uri Avon, and I'm based in Baltimore. Some 30 years ago, I was the planning director in Howard County. And before and during and since then, I've interacted with Columbia in many different ways at the university, which is where I currently teach as well, and have done projects in Howard County, most recently with Erin Talkington of RCLCO, working on the US 1 corridor, Snowden River Parkway, and Gateway market study and land use plan. So I've been a consultant prior to being an academic for something like 30 years as well. Apart from my public sector work, that little map at the bottom of my column there happens to be Tyson's Corner. That's the redevelopment plan that I was part of for Tyson's Corner about 8 years ago. So this is my bread and butter as well as my academic interest.
I'm Anne Forsythe. I've got these headphones on because I've got a very noisy fan behind me and I'm trying not to interrupt too much. I'm a faculty member at Harvard University. I studied Columbia about 20 years ago. I'm a long-term fan of new towns, and I'm actually just about to publish a book on new towns globally. And Columbia is a very important part of that global group. But my other area of expertise is looking at healthy communities, and I hope I could contribute that at some stage during these discussions.
Great, thank you. I'm going to minimize my screen and pull up. There we go. So I'm going to have each of the, I got to move all my faces, sorry. I'm going to have each of you, if you could just go through the order that you appear in this list so we're not talking over each other, and just your name and your affiliation, and so we could see, match the face with the voice and everything, that would be great. So starting with Alan.
Yeah, Alan Klein. I'm the Columbia Council rep from Harper's Choice, and therefore one of the 10 members of Columbia Association and on the CA board.
Great. Next in line, Nancy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nancy McCord. I'm the CA rep to the CA board from Wild Lake, the oldest village in Columbia, or the first village, I should say.
Hi, I'm Sherry Zarrett. I'm the representative from King's Contrivance on the CA Board of Directors.
Great.
Hi, I'm Andy Stack. I'm the rep from Owen Brown.
Hello, I'm Renee Dubois. I'm the CA rep from River Hill.
And I'm Dick Bolton from Dorsey Search.
Lynn, are you here?
She missed another meeting too.
Forwarded her the number just before, but
All right.
She's there. She's
Hey,
there.
Lynn,
Not hearing
You're
you.
muted. You got to unmute yourself. In the lower left corner of your screen.
Or the upper right if it's an iPad.
or you can click on your picture and then it'll say unmute.
I wonder if she's confusing. And there's two Lynn's from Town Center.
No, I can
And
see
so from Town Center, Linny.
Oh.
you are.
Oh, sorry. So Lynn Egan, yes.
Janet Evans from Longreach Board of Directors.
Jenny Thomas, CA Board of Directors from Oakland Mills.
And I'm Jessamine Duval from the CA Board from Hickory Ridge.
Great. Thank you. Okay, the village representatives. Chrissy here?
Maybe she's running late.
Okay, how about Bryn?
Hi, this is Bryn Conover. I'm the village rep from Harper's Choice. Glad to meet everybody tonight.
Hello, good evening. My name is Jansen Evelyn. I'm on the Village of Hickory Ridge. I'm a board member there.
Hi, I'm Beverly Myers. I'm the village manager from King's Contrivance.
Hi, I'm Dave Wissing. I'm the village rep for Long Reach.
Good evening. I'm Paul Verchinsky. I've lived in Oakland Mills since 1973, and I'm on the Oakland Mills board. I'd like to commend CA for the excellent team for this new town planning endeavor. However, I feel like I've seen this scene before. Hopefully we have a better outcome. I smiled when I looked at the bios for the consultant team since I could have been on this team. I'm a civil engineer and have worked as a project manager for the New Communities Administration in the Department of Housing and Urban Development that built new towns. I oversaw the Woodlands, St. Charles City in Southern Maryland, and the Jonathan Newtown outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul. I met George Mitchell, the original developer of the Woodlands, as well as Rouse. Currently, I'm on the Howard County Citizens Association board where we are involved with all issues related to the general plan, zoning, and new construction. We testify on a regular basis before the county council, the planning board, zoning board, and other county entities. The HCCA was started in 1961 because of a rumor that a developer was buying up a lot of land in Howard County. That developer was James Rouse.
Mm-hmm.
I also was the planning director for transportation planning in the Federal Transit Administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, we'll look forward to your input from all that experience. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Brad Butler. I'm the representative from the Owen Brown Village Board. I look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Lynn Fearcobb. I'm Town Center Board Chair.
Hi, I'm Laura Torres. I am the Vice Chair for the Wild Lake Village Center.
Okay, thank you. And do we have the rest of the CA leadership in this group, Kristen? Or?
Yes, I'm Milton Matthews. I'm the president
Association.
And hi, I'm Susan Krabby. I'm Vice President and CFO.
Great.
Hi, I'm Sherry Fanaroff. Actually, it's not spelled correctly here, but that's okay. I'm Sherry Fanaroff. I'm CA's General Counsel.
Okay, great. And Dennis. Is Dennis with us?
He's here. Dennis, you out there?
Dennis Matty with the Director of Open Space and Facility Services for the Columbia Association. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to go back onto full screen. So so we just went through and listed our team. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. So why are we here tonight? Kristen gave some background for you. We're going to be really having a series. We have 7 workshops outlined, and I believe you got the schedules. We have all those dates set. And again, we appreciate everyone's quick response on confirming those dates so that we can get this scheduled out. And really these first 4 workshops is a discovery phase where we talk about big ideas. We really confirm what's working, what's not working on a number of topics. A lot of it's really listening to all of you and having some dialogue about this. And then as we move into workshops 5 and 6, we focus more on starting to develop framework or outlining the issues, the opportunities, solutions, having a draft policy framework, and then moving into the final policy framework at workshop 7. We designed this process to be very fluid. It's a very ambitious agenda for each of these meetings within 2 hours in the framework of Zoom. So we have the flexibility when we get to the synthesis phase that we have some more time built into those workshops. If some of the discussion in this discovery phase has to move into those later workshops, we have the flexibility to do that. So we have 3 main topics tonight: diversity, open spaces, and civic engagement. We may not get through all 3 of those. We'll do our best, but we want to really have good discussions. So if we don't make all 3, we'll be able to pick up the schedule on later workshops. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Steve. Steve, I'm going to stop sharing now so you can pull up your screen.
Easy for you to say. Okay. I've only done 100 of these things. Oh, there we go. Are we seeing that, today's agenda?
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't hit the agenda. So as I said, we'll do a break about 8:10, but we're going to be talking about a process overview. Steve's going to review the founding principles, just a real quick overview on the questionnaire, the kind of the big idea. And then when we get into the individual topics of diversity, open space, and stewardship, and civic engagement, we're going to be talking about some data, some current trending in some of the case study communities, and then having discussion after each of those. So Steve.
Well, one of the things that Kirsten mentioned was this idea of comparing to other communities. And so I just wanted to start by just mentioning that, because as we go through the presentation, you'll see data from these other communities. And so you're going like, why are we doing that? And I think the original, one of the ideas that the staff had was to do some benchmarking and not just talk about Columbia kind of in a vacuum, but also sort of look at, what are some other comparable master plan communities doing? And this is a really interesting group of master plan communities because, as I mentioned before, there was a series of what we call the classics, if you're in my field, of sort of the study of large-scale new communities. And Columbia and Reston and Irvine and Woodlands were in that group, and they were all pioneered by very vision-oriented developers, and they all kind of defined the practice of master plan communities for us in the second half of the 20th century. And so one of the things you're going to see as we go through this is we're going to have some data and some benchmarking against these other communities. And Anne Forsythe has written books about them. I actually was head of planning for 5 years at the Irvine company on the Irvine Ranch. So I've got obviously intimate knowledge of that to bring to the table. So anyway, that's going to be a little bit part, and should be fairly interesting sort of counterpoint to our discussions. We thought, even though you all are true experts on Columbia and probably know this story much even better than I do, we just thought it'd be good to briefly, just sort of go through sort of the foundation of the community and just hit on the 4 primary principles. And so we're doing that in a manner where we're sort of talking first about kind of what was the status quo when Rouse sort of engaged in his process of envisioning and planning the community back in the 1960s. And one of the things that he was very concerned with was just the notion of sprawl and kind of what was happening out there. And I'm not going to read this quote. Each of these slides has a quote from him, which I thought were really good. And he was really complaining about the ad hoc character of communities. And so his idea was the first principle was building a complete city. That really had everything. That we all know that no city is really completely self-sufficient. It connects with other cities and environs and regions around it. However, he wanted a city that really had it all, and had jobs and housing, and had parks scaled, not the minimum size, but to meet the needs of the population, and had, this hierarchy of retail centers, had a full array of culture, and had a good transportation infrastructure, and a variety of housing. And so the complete city was probably one of the most powerful foundational, concepts. The other thing, though, that was going on at the time was the racial and economic lack of racial and economic sort of equity, that was going on. And you can see, some images here, some statistics of what was going on in terms of, redlining, the desegregation of schools, lack of the Johnson War on Poverty. These were all kind of milestones that were occurring sort of during that period where Rouse was sort of envisioning Columbia. And his response to that was this idea of a place for people to grow, but not just certain people, but all people. And as you all know, the diversity, economic and housing diversity, and racial and ethnic access and openness were real key foundations. And this was really, and probably more so than any of these other classic communities, a foundational principle for Columbia. And also in there was this notion of lifelong learning, where the schools were to be smaller and more progressive, and smaller, better student to teacher ratios, and then also civic interaction with a large cultural and civic sort of backbone. And then also Rouse was religious and believed that every community should have an opportunity to have a spiritual life. And so, as you know, he built in the interfaith centers, and these all, came together and sort of synthesized with the landscape. And one of the things that he was very concerned about was the lack of sensitivity to the natural environment. So he was quite ahead of his time in that respect as well. Now, Woodlands, was probably even more ambitious in terms of environmental planning than the Columbia was, but both were far ahead of their time compared to conventional, development practices. And so, of course, this wonderful matrix of open space and retention of drainage ways and the trail system and the lake system and the fact that over a third of the space was preserved as open space. And the other thing that we'll talk about over the sessions is this notion of green infrastructure. And that's a term that CA uses today and the community uses. And that's actually, most communities across the country don't even know what that is. And this notion of not only having open space, but having open space that connects and links and has ecological value. And this concept was decades, ahead of its time. And then the fourth principle, it really comes from the economic sustainability. And it's termed make a profit. And so it sounds a little sort of crude when you look at it on face value, but when you really dig under what was driving that, the context at the time was that master plan communities in the United States had really struggled. There was a whole federally funded Green Towns program before World War II that was very interesting in terms of like Greenbelt, Maryland, which you see here, was very interesting in terms of studies in design and urban design and planning, but were all pretty much failures, I think, except Jonathan, I think maybe was, well, that came later, but they struggled because they weren't driven by the market. They weren't driven by kind of a sense of fiduciary, responsibility or at least insight. And then the federal New Towns program that was starting to develop about the time that Reston and the Classics started also, struggled. There were a few that did well. But I think in this backdrop is when was how Rouse said, look, if this is going to be a success and we're going to achieve our social goals, it has to be able to meet its economic goals. And so they developed a model called the Columbia Economic Model, which actually became a model for a lot of new communities in the following decades, because it was built on large scale private master plan community financial discipline and pro forma analysis, and took a long view of developing the community. And it was really, again, quite a breakthrough for its time. Now, all four of these principles, of course, came together in the master plan. And the master plan had these key components, which you all are intimately familiar with. The village concept which is organizing this meeting with around village representatives. Within those villages, there were neighborhood clusters, which were meant to break down the scale of the village so you'd have smaller social units, and which would lead to a higher sense of social cohesion and engagement. And then in each of the villages, of course, you had your village centers, which were the center of village life. And then you had your town center, which was the home for those types of retail and employment and cultural facilities that required an entire community to support them. And then of course, the open space green belts, which we discussed, which separated the villages. And then the loop road network, which was designed to, again, reinforce a sense of place and a sense of definition for the individual villages. So, I mean, that's just a background, which again, I know you all are, this is singing to the choir here, but I thought it would be good just to lay that foundation as we kind of move forward. And so the question now is, and, these principles, are they still working? Are they still relevant? And I think those are some of the questions that we want to explore over the next several months. And, we just thought you all took this questionnaire that we put together. And I think, I'm sure we could have asked a lot of different questions and probably better questions, but at least as a starting place, we thought it was a good place to start to kind of get the pulse. And we organized it based on not so much the 4 pillars of the original Rouse vision, but the CA led a visioning process, sort of a refinement process in 2015. And out of that came these 5 kind of topics, which kind of reframed the vision. So we just kind of threw those out there, as you know, and said, which of these do you sense is most important or has the highest priority? It's kind of a false choice because we don't have to choose, between.
Dave,
Yeah.
we have a question from Paul.
Sure.
Yes.
I'd like to comment on these formative principles. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to put on the table for consideration the following, because I think it's germane to this particular discussion. Rouse was named as the developer by the Howard County Council in 1967 and needed to follow certain requirements in Columbia's development. Anyone wanting to develop in Columbia first needed Rouse's planning and architectural approval before any county approvals. When the Rouse Company sold to General Growth Properties, that oversight responsibility went to General Growth, or GGP. Unfortunately, GGP went bankrupt and was subsequently bought by the Howard Hughes Corporation, which is also the current developer of the Woodlands. The Howard Hughes Corporation came before the HCCA, and that's why I brought it up a few years ago, and stated the following, that their current and design oversight in Columbia is perfunctory and that another entity should perform that function. To date, no entity has been formed to make sure that there is excellent design and planning for Columbia in the next 25 to 50 years. The county has stated on numerous occasions that they do not perform these functions and do not want to. The Woodlands was recently faced with similar issues and decided to incorporate as a township. In my opinion, the founding principle has gone awry and needs to be addressed. My question is, what are the options for Columbia? That's what I'd like to bring up.
Well, I think that's a great question. We're gonna have a slide and an opportunity for some discussion after this first phase of the presentation. It's probably coming up shortly. So we'll start to have some discussion at that point, and we can address the question then, if that's okay.
And I would just add, though, Paul, that one of the topics in our array of topics is governance. It's not a topic that we're actually focusing on tonight. It actually comes up in one of the future topics, and Uri who's on our team is going to tackle that topic in depth. And so we have a time in a subsequent meeting. It doesn't mean we don't need to talk about it tonight. I'm just saying there's a whole time set aside for talking about design guidelines and governance within the community. So there can be an in-depth engagement at that point as well.
Yeah, I take your point, and essentially what Howard County did was give a free hand almost to the developer. And that function is no longer in place. It's gone. And the county wants nothing to do with it. Matter of fact, their planning board and their design advisory panel can't cope with this, in my opinion, having seen what's been happening over the last decade.
Okay, well, we will circle back around and we'll have a focused discussion on that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to proceed. I just, this isn't meant to have an in-depth discussion on this at this point, because as this overall ranking, we put it up because, like I was saying, it's a bit of a false choice. We don't have to, choose between these. We're going to discuss all of them, and we're going to develop policy related to all of them. But it was just of interest that diversity and inclusion clearly came on as strong, and stewardship in the open space system came on very strong, and land use, and then the other two had less of a priority. So it's just it doesn't drive us any place, but it's just interesting to note. And diversity and inclusion will be the first thing we're talking about tonight after we sort of get through our this introductory piece. In fact, oh, look, there it is. So our timing is perfect. Just to start on diversity and inclusion, this was just one of Rouse's. No, actually, this came from the Guiding Principles for the 21st Century, the 2015 sort of vision discussion. Rouse built Columbia as an open community, we know, and modeled to overcome racial and economic discrimination and segregation. You all received a package. Oh, let's talk about the survey in a little bit more detail. So these were topics, these were questions in the survey that kind of related to diversity. And the way you read these, there's two ways of reading these. First of all, the bottom, number 5, means that you agreed the most, okay? So the more the bars are lengthened at the bottom of these graphs, it means that's the strongest positive response. And also the number tells you that out of a total of between 1 and 5, this is the average response. So you can see these were very high in terms of diversity. And it's a very strong reinforcement of Rouse's original principles, and that a continuation of those related to openness to all economic levels. And it's interesting, the third one, as I read it, is one of the things we put in here, you'll notice there's a couple questions about, should we be sort of really thinking hard about making, shifting Columbia towards more of a younger sort of emerging demographic. And the reason we put that in there is because the other communities that, are sort of our benchmarking communities are thinking along those lines, very seriously. And so I just think it's interesting that, there was kind of a mediocre response to this as a priority. And we'll talk about this more as we go forward, but I thought that was interesting. A couple of other questions here. And again, the other thing that's occurring in a number of these other communities is there's more growth of multi-ethnicity in them. There's in-migration across the country in terms of different groups, and should the communities be responding to that, sort of in an intentional way? Kind of a mixed response. I mean, a positive response, not a negative one, but not as strong as some of the others. And then also, as we get into housing, diversity of housing was, of course, one of the founding. And we have a whole session on housing in our next meeting, so we don't need to. But again, there was a positive response, but not as positive as some of the others. And again, the last question about, another concern of some of these other benchmark communities are, are our kids and our grandkids going to want to live here? And so we got a strong response, not as strong as some of the others, but a positive response. So I think in summary here on diversity, everything got a positive response, but I think in terms of economic and ethnic and racial diversity, it was kind of the strongest. Now, in your packet that you got, you saw a somewhat withering amount of data that we collected. We're not going to go through it in detail here. It's too much. I'm sure you scanned it and you saw, some of the high points. But what I am going to do here is I'm going to just hit some of the conclusions of that data. Now, this only relates to diversity, our first topic. But and what we saw was Columbia's aging, as are most other PCs, and there could be implications here on housing facility design and program needs. That's something we can talk about or not if we don't think it's important. Of course, as the community is aging, it means the percentage of young people is reducing, and we may want to just ask the question: is that a good or bad thing? The reason it might be of concern is a number of these other benchmark communities, if they're going to maintain their economic vitality and their tax base and fresh economic development, it needs to be attractive to a younger emerging workforce. So that's why that's a valid, question to maybe discuss. The percentage of non-white. Yes.
Just wanted to interrupt. So I'm making note of people raising their hands. There's also an opportunity in the chat box if you want to ask a question there. So I'm making notes of the hands that I see raised that we could maybe, we'll call on you when we get to the discussion
Yeah,
phase.
so we're almost there. In any second here, we're going to be. I just want to hit on these. Also, there's everybody knows this. All the villages have a significant mix of race and ethnicity. Compared to other cities, Columbia has a high ranking in social and ethnic diversity. In other words, Columbia is more diverse than most other communities, benchmark communities. And current social equity movements might impact present or future strategies. We know, of course, what's going on across the country in terms of social equity movements. And so I'm hoping we can talk about that. So these are kind of, what we saw as the implications of the data. You have lots of questions and points. And then I'm just going to hit on lastly, before we get to those, as we look at those other master plan communities, we're seeing more racially ethnic diversity due to in-migration, and it's regional. On the West Coast, it tends to be more Asian. In the Southwest, it tends to be more Hispanic. There's also Indian and Middle Eastern pockets growing in a number of these communities. So what are these other MPCs doing in response to that? And some of them are focusing on greater variety of ethnic special events and celebrations. We're seeing shifts in retailing to capture unique ethnic needs and preferences. There's also a growth of special interest groups and affinity groups and activity groups related to those ethnicities. And then maybe a little bit on the less positive side is we're seeing some migrations occurring even within the master plan communities or in the areas around the master plan communities where there's ethnic clustering and groupings that are occurring. So these are just to give you an idea of what's going on elsewhere. But I think now we can sort of open it up and get some of your comments and questions going. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand this back to Tom right now.
Yes. Great, thanks, Steve. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some discussion now. I'm going to be the scribe and record some notes off to the left as well. Just a warning, I'm going to be typing quickly, so I'll probably be making some typos, so I'll fix them later. So don't get distressed if I'm not fixing the typos as I go along. But one of the things that, the other thing I've been noting is, as I noted, people raising their hands, would like to, as much as possible, try to keep our discussion right now on this topic of population diversity. Other topics that you bring up, like Paul, for example, you talked about some governance and design guidelines. I'm going to record them here. If there are things that we're going to be talking about in the future, we can touch on it a little bit tonight, but I'll keep track of them so that in our future workshops, we can have some focused discussion on some of those areas of interest just to try to keep us on track. So I know before we get into this main discussion question, Alan Rand had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Alan Klein. A couple of things, a quick question about the study, and then 2 or 3 comments. Was the study set up so that all those questions could have gotten equally high scores, or was it more of a forced choice ranking thing where not everything could be scored 5 out of 5?
It was, I think it was a agree and disagree. So there could have been, higher. It could have been all number 5. So
They could have all gotten high. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to say just quickly that this is the first time that I've heard any consultants, and that includes Mahan Reichel, give such a good overview of what Columbia is and why it is. So I appreciate that. I think one of the things that's happening is we need to make sure we widen our definition of diversity. Diversity doesn't just mean racial, ethnic. There's all kinds of communities we need to be considering. And so I want to make sure we don't limit our discussion just to the race and ethnicity. And although it's implicit in what Rouse talked about, inclusion is really where the rubber meets the road. Diversity describes what is. Inclusion is what we do with that diversity, and whether that people who are of all kinds of identities feel welcome and can have the kind of life and make the kind of impact that they want to make. And we need to make sure we're focusing on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. There were some other hand raised. Anne, did you catch those?
Yeah, earlier on, Ms. Dubois, you had your hand up. I just wanted to check that you'd been. Yep.
Yes, but my question was answered, so thank you.
That's good. And then Dick Bolton. Dick, oh, you need to, yes.
I had to unmute. Yeah, I agree. We have a very diverse community, which is admirable. The problem is that it is clustered, and we don't really have it integrated. We have some problems there because I think, as Alan pointed out, we need inclusion. We need people working together, not this community over here and that community over there. And one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the review is the effect that the school system has on this. And recently we had a redistricting which just made the problem worse. And we have to solve that if we really want to see inclusion, if we really want to see racial, ethnic, socioeconomic diversity. We need an integration. We're going to have to consider the role the schools play in that.
So, Dick, just a question on that, on the school districting, is what that led to, again, was a higher concentrations of, say, of certain ethnic groups or certain economic groups within a district?
Oh yeah, and one of the problems is that we have high schools that are considered to be the choice high schools, and we have others that are considered to be problem high schools. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because the families that really put a high emphasis on education, of course, are going to gravitate toward the choice high schools. And of course, this goes through the whole system, elementary on up. And some people are going to be wanting to spend more money for less house just to get into the right district. And so then the issue becomes not only are their kids getting a good education, but what's the value of their house? And so this redistricting has a powerful impact on the composition of the community. And if people are in the right district, they don't want that district to change. And so that really has a negative effect. I notice real estate signs go up and they tell you what the high school district is, just to give you an idea of how important that is to some people. And we had a redistricting situation in our community a number of years back where a board member changed the districting just so her kids could get into the right school. So this is a problem, and we can't just ignore it.
Lyndall Egan also has a comment. You have to unmute.
Sorry. Following up with Dick, we do tend to have higher density in Columbia than in other parts of the county. And the fact that we're a county school system, county police system, I think makes it more difficult to, sort of to be our own community. I'm curious, do the other communities like the Woodlands, are they incorporated or are they like Columbia, part of a county system?
Ann can talk to the others. I can talk to Irvine. Irvine incorporated way back in 1971 and created their own school district as a part of that, and basically has ended up over time becoming one of the highest quality school districts. Now, even within the community, there are variations, right? I mean, that it's big enough that, I mean, Irvine's by far the biggest of any of these benchmarks, and so there tends to still be variations within the community. The other thing that's happened is there's been quite a bit of master developer additional cash pushed into the educational system to help elevate the technology and other aspects above what a purely the other surrounding public school systems have been able to achieve.
Okay, yeah, again, I live in town center, of course, and I have lived in many of the older villages in Columbia. My grandkids are growing up in Wild Lake right now. And again, the schools have, the schools have changed dramatically. They're all getting good educations. You know, the educational quality of the county system is very good. But again, it's creating just almost a misperception in the community that Columbia is not as well as easy to live in some of the older villages as the more suburban neighborhoods. Whereas again, what we're hoping to build here is much more of an urban community than we've had before. We seem to have done everything but the downtown.
Miss Zaret? Is it SB Zaret? Oh, you've got you're muted.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I was in terms of thinking about diversity and inclusion, maybe a third element that we'll need to add is equity. When we were starting off new, when Columbia was starting off new and things could be built literally from the ground up, everything was new. Now we are adding on to what already exists. And the issue of equity, for example, between the older schools and the newer schools, keeps arising every time we come into some kind of community process. So maybe we need to have a better understanding and explore what equity actually is. And that is a discussion that we really haven't had yet. Thank you.
Bryn Conover.
Hi, I don't know at what point this would be appropriate in the discussion, but I've heard several times in previous conversations around Columbia, and somebody mentioned tonight the concept of Columbia as an urban environment. And I wonder if there's plans or talks about is there a size that we're trying to plan for, or a certain kind of density we're trying to plan for, or like what's sort of the ultimate definition or goal of what Columbia would look like as an urban environment versus what it has been?
Well, I think that's one of the questions that we want to tackle. You know, in this process, we have one of our sessions coming up on redevelopment. We have a focus on housing, where we can talk about diversity of housing and the density of housing and neighborhoods. But we also have a session on redevelopment, where that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about downtown Columbia and sort of the direction it's going. And I think that would be a good time to dig into that. But I think part of this process is to develop a position of this group of stakeholders as to what is a preferred sort of end game character. I mean, there never really is an end game, because cities continue to evolve, and we as planners believe that's a good thing. But you know, we can talk about that a little bit more, and we'll share And I think most of you are probably aware of the plans that Howard Hughes has for downtown Columbia, and but we'll recap on some of those when we get to that particular topic, and we can, have a robust discussion on that. But one of the questions was, and it was put in there purposefully, is the higher density housing redevelopment provides an opportunity for guiding diversity to a certain extent of housing and price point and size of unit and character of unit. And so when we have that discussion, we should have it in the context of diversity and equity and inclusion.
Just so you know, I'm going through first time speakers, and then the second time speakers will get a chance in a moment. Ginny Thomas.
Okay. Thank you. Just briefly, when Rouse created Columbia, it was easier because he had a lot of control, and you could get diversity in your villages, your neighborhoods. So there was economic diversity, racial diversity, and your schools look like that. It was there was not a problem. What happened in the last 20 years, and I don't quite know how we're going to really solve this, is the county officials decided that the affordable housing mostly would be located in different neighborhoods, especially in Columbia, not even in all of Columbia. And as a result of that, that meant you had less diversity, economic diversity in your schools, and you had schools labeled because they had a very high farm rate, free and reduced lunches. And that, I don't know how you deal with that. And especially while, I can understand in a village center, you want to have housing. Depending on what type of housing, you could be compounding it in your older villages. And with the reluctance of the county to actually require developers outside of Columbia to have affordable housing, or stop letting them get away with giving the money instead of the housing. And the money goes into a fund, and it's usually spent in Columbia, has been our experience, and in the older villages. So that catch-22 situation really is going to be very difficult for us to have any impact at all until the county officials start realizing that they have to stop creating the problem and have affordable housing throughout the county.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're ready to go to a couple of people the second time. I'm just checking in on time. But Mr. Vachinsky, Paul Vachinsky.
Yes, I'll be brief. I'll second everything that was said before. I would just raise a question, and that is, what we are in this today in talking, we are what I would term engaged Columbians. I'm assuming that you're going to get to other folks. They will probably have a very different view on Columbia. That's my guess, having talked to other folks. And since I live in one of the older villages, Oakland Mills, the problems with the schools are basically based in Columbia now, because most of our schools are Title X schools. They have a high farm rate. And when you look at the schools outside of Columbia, you don't see that as much. And then to compound things, in my particular village, it has taken us years to get a 50-year-old elementary school finally replaced. So I would say that there's also been disinvestment in some of the older villages. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dick Bolton?
Yes, you brought up the question of urbanism. The way Rouse designed Columbia is there were going to be 10 villages, and the middle village was going to be the urban core of the entire community. And the outlying villages were going to be more suburban, but this was going to be an exciting, dynamic center of town. And that was the plan. And I think it's been a very effective plan. And it's exciting now. He said he wanted a complete city. And we're getting that. And it means a lot of development downtown, which will attract a younger group. And there's a critical mass that once you reach enough people who see this as an exciting place for a young person to live, because there are other young people there, I think that's going to improve our generational diversity.
Excellent.
Great point.
That's all the hands that are up at the moment. Just to let you know.
Would you say, Ann?
That's all the hands that are up at the moment. So we might be able, I don't know how you want to transition on, but just everyone's had their say.
Yes. Well, maybe it's about 8:03, so we'll take a break shortly. But we saw a lot of written comments in addition to the boxes checked in the survey. There were a lot of written comments, a lot of really great feedback. We just got this back yesterday, so we still have to absorb all the comments in there. So we'll be folding these into future discussions as well. But were there any comments that any of you made on here related to diversity that you haven't raised already that you'd like to bring up?
Just reading them, they're quite vibrant about like wanting to define diversity, talk about age groups, and particularly some interesting, so it's really about age diversity, but also on like the multitudes of diversity in Columbia, as if I had to summarize the comments that I've been reading.
Yeah, I mean, the two themes that come out of the informal comments tend to be a concern about affordability. That even though the Columbia is relatively affordable relative to Howard County, it's still, quote, not very affordable because everything is moved up. The tidewater's pulling everything up. And then there are comments about, wanting to keep our eye on this younger generation and, what can we do to make it accessible to the younger generation. And I think the comment was just made about downtown Columbia, the higher density, more urban housing clearly is creating a character alignment with younger generations. Is the pricing of that aligned? I don't know. And we're going to have a very nice in-depth presentation by RCLCO on housing in Columbia and Howard County. Actually, in our next meeting, that'll kick off the beginning of our next meeting, so we can dig deeper into the pricing and affordability issue at that point. Okay, Tom, shall we break?
Yeah, why don't we take a 5-minute break? I have 8:05, so at 8:10 we can come back. I know I need to take a quick break. So we'll see everyone back here at 8:10. Thank you.
And you don't have to leave if you don't want to.
So Steve, may I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any experience? I think it's Houston. It was either Austin or Houston that had a program called Housing First, where they, not that we have a large homeless population here, but they spent an enormous amount of time and effort to get people that were homeless into good, what they considered good, stable housing, so that they could get their kids into school and not have them move from school to school, jobs, education, etc.
Austin has, I'm familiar with the program in Austin.
It's Austin, okay.
It's very impressive what they've done there. And I think it's, I forget what it's called, Community First or something like that. But it was actually sponsored not by the public sector, but by a private individual who just visionary. And the theory was that, and it's interesting because there's a whole theory on people that are suffering from homelessness, that it's all about housing first. And his theory was that it was about community first. And that if you brought them into a community and you made them a part of a community, that was that created the foundation. And so they created a community on the outskirts of Austin that started off with basically mobile homes.
Okay.
And is transitioning, or no, I take it back, sort of small mini home, prefab housing, small prefab housing. And then they have a second phase of mobile homes. And they're actually doing some of the first digital printing homes. I was out there, they're actually under construction, digital printed homes, and they're very small. And but the real interesting thing about the community is that everybody has a job.
Right.
And they put everybody to work,
and
everybody pays rent. So they create their own microeconomy.
Right.
And everybody learns how to participate in that microeconomy. And it gets them into a different sort of modality, and just an incredibly interesting place and successful.
Okay. So it's called Community First?
I think so. I've got it in my notes someplace.
Could you find out and just let me know at the next meeting?
Sure.
Because I think that, I don't see a holistic approach to anything. I see this and I see that, but I don't see a holistic approach to anything. And I only read a short article about it, I guess about 2 months ago. And it sounded like they were trying to work on a more holistic approach for the people that went into this community.
There's also a very interesting place in San Antonio, but it's less about, it's less progressive on the housing side. It doesn't have the, it has permanent supportive housing, but doesn't necessarily have the, this whole community-based housing resource.
And that's in San Antonio?
It's in San Antonio, yeah.
Could you give me
a little closer to home? I'm sorry, a little closer to home, the Bridges to Housing Stability folks here in Howard County are emphasizing that as well.
Right.
It's about 8:12. Should we get started again? And I stopped sharing my screen, Steve, if you want to pick up on the presentation.
I sure will. Are you seeing open space and stewardship?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears and we're going to go to our second topic, open space and stewardship. And this also had, a pretty strong response in the, whoops, let me get into presentation mode here. I'm sorry, I need to. Here, let me do this. There we go. Are you seeing it now?
We're seeing your notes page. So it might be a
we're
few of
seeing
the
your
goals.
presenter's view.
The presenter
I think up
view.
in the top left, you switch your screen. There you go.
You have to, within PowerPoint, you switch, yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay. Okay for this. Again, sort of an overarching, statement that I thought was pretty well written. The distinctive weave of Columbia's open spaces, neighborhoods, and other development is a distinguishing feature of the community. And I agree with this. So when you look at other plans of other master plan communities, Columbia's, the use of the natural landscape to create scale and sort of define the villages is somewhat unique, and it works really, pretty strongly. If we look at some of the survey results on this, there are some themes in here that I think are kind of interesting. It starts off by talking about, the level of sort of maintenance, and it's strong. It's not out of the park, but it's a strong positive endorsement of the level of maintenance and investment in the open space. Now, when we start going a little sideways when we get into, is this 50-year-old park system, on target for today's population and lifestyle? Well, maybe not so much. This might be something that needs to be talked about a little bit. And then again, when we get into for this younger, high quality workforce, it's like, yeah, it's generally aligned, but there's still a little bit of dissent on that. There's a sort of mixed messaging on should we maybe be thinking a little bit about the system and bringing it up to date. The current character and update of the natural open space is appropriate and not in need of restoration or reforestation. So this is a little bit less about the facilities and more about just the ecological quality of the open space. And there seems to be, again, a generally strong endorsement that, yeah, it's in pretty good shape, but there's a little bit of maybe not so much. So we'd like to hear from some of you that think that maybe there needs to be some thought about that. And again, here when we ask about, is it sufficiently diverse and scaled for the current Columbia population? There's a question here, about generally so, but maybe, it's worth looking at. And do we need to, does there need to be a greater focus on the aging population? And it's interesting that on this one, there's a little bit of alignment with the previous topic. And I think I'm seeing a pattern of, let's think more about our younger population than our aging population, just a little bit. I mean, that's where our focus should be. Not that we don't need to focus on our aging population, but if we needed to set priorities. And then there's just a question about Symphony Woods, because there was a Symphony Woods being a central park. Quite a bit of work was done on it in the recent past. And so just asking, how is that coming? And well, maybe we should talk about it. Yeah. Switching to the data on parks and open space, these were the things that we kind of saw, that, this commitment to open space in Columbia far exceeds what a typical American city has per capita, but is generally at par with the other master plan communities. So, the commitment to the open space was special relative to the background, noise in terms of development. But if you look at these other classic, they were also, pretty well endowed with open space. Also, when we look at the facilities, it fares well, But all these other communities also had a pretty strong commitment, as master plan communities tend to do. The master developers tend to amenitize higher than typical communities. The previous surveys have indicated the community is very satisfied with the level of recreation facilities provided. But this is just responding to some past survey work that CA has done. And generally the comments were, yeah, we think we've got it pretty good here. And we think the level of maintenance is good, but gosh, it's kind of expensive to maintain. Don't feel you're alone on that. That tends to be the case in most master plan communities. In terms of the pathway system, it has a lot, as you know, But when we looked at these other master plan communities, the classics, we were kind of surprised to find that they actually had more than Columbia has. But it's still more than most other cities have. So the Walk Howard and Connect, these studies we found that had been done by the county and also by Columbia for relative to active mobility and walking, we thought were very strong studies, and we were impressed that those had been developed. They're forward-looking, they're very thoughtful and strategic, and so we think those are pretty good, and want to see how we think those are coming. And then there have been forestation and invasive species programs that have been implemented in the Columbia open space system. And we think those are good. That's forward thinking, because you'll see here in a second that is not unlike some of these other communities. So those were the things, the highlights we saw as we did our research and looked out at our other communities. In terms of trending in these other communities, I've got a little bit more here than on the others. I'll make it as fast as I can. One of the things that's occurring both nationally and internationally is sort of a rethinking of the complexity of the ecology of the open space system. And there's this notion of green infrastructure and this whole idea of landscape services. And so you can see in this graphic, there's just a more scientific look at the open space and how those different landscape services can be improved, including open space access and trail connectivity, enhanced wildlife movement and genetic health, reduced urban heat island effects. This design of looking at the open space in terms of multifunctionality is a big part of the movement. So that's one of the things we're seeing out there. And I didn't see a lot about that when I studied, when we studied what was going on in Columbia. I might have missed that. Another trend, of course, everybody knows about farm to table, sort of more focus on healthy eating, at least some segments, of the population. And so a lot of the new communities are looking at how to, respond to this. And they're incorporating not just, they're incorporating community gardens, and you have 3 of them, and they're pretty sizable, and they look pretty good. I studied them on Google Earth. I couldn't visit them in person, but this is different than that. These are actually farms that are range in size from 2 to 40 acres, and they're actually farmed by farmers and generating production that actually goes out into the community, for consumption. There's also a focus on participatory educational programs for children and family relative to growing food, so that families and children can reconnect with what food really is and where it comes from, other than from a grocery store. You have a robust farmers market, or you did, prior to the pandemic. But so you're doing that. But the other thing that's happening, and I'm not sure I saw much of this, maybe it's out there in Columbia, but there's a movement in terms of food festivals and fairs that has really taken on across the country. The Smorgasburg is probably the biggest example, where every week you might have 10,000 people coming in to a food fair, and it's not like once a year; it happens every weekend, And so that's we're seeing those popping up. So we just wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And then the last thing, and I mentioned, I guess this is a little bit of overlap with the first one, but communities are looking at the biodiversity and the ecological aspects of their open space system. They're incorporating biofiltration regimes. They're actually thinking of landscape as part of a carbon sequestration strategies for reducing their carbon footprint. And there's a whole science that has developed around that now. And then as new projects come on board, biodiversity indexing is used to filter the landscape palette to make sure that it is doing more than just becoming an aesthetic landscape, but actually increasing. And then we're also seeing reforestation programs in some of these older communities, and as well. And you're doing some of this invasive species eradication. So that's my intensive stream of consciousness download for you. And I look forward to, again, hearing some comments and seeing some hands raised on some of these topics.
Yes, and we had, well, I think maybe we'll start with just this question that's up on the board, and then I know Anne is going to read some of the comments that have been coming through the chat to have some discussions. But so, seeing the results of the survey and some of these data and trends, does that help clarify your vision and priorities on open space? We have some raised hands here.
I think Dick Bolton has had his hand up for the longest.
Okay.
Yeah, I jumped to the front of the line there. I saw where you were going with this. A couple of points. First of all, you should be aware that a really huge piece of CA's budget goes to open space. So this is a top priority for the Columbia Association. There's an interesting thing about the open space that Rouse set aside is a lot of it was unbuildable. He put the open space on the floodplains and along the steep slopes, and in a way, the more exciting, the more interesting landscape. What you see in the rest of the county is the developer comes in, they clear cut it and flatten it, and they do that in our out parcels, which is a problem. And instead of trying to preserve the old growth trees and some of the better amenities. And I had one other thought that goes back when we were talking about diversity. I hope it's not too late to put this in. You talk about older people, older adults, and there are really two classes of older people. There's the old and the old. The old people are people who are probably retired. They paid off the mortgage. The kids have graduated from college. As my dad said, life begins when kids graduate from college and the dog dies. But these are the people who have a lot of free time. They're entering a second teenager, and they have one set of needs, and they're quite often quite similar to what the millennials are looking for. Whereas on the other side, you've got the much older people, and they've got all kinds of physical issues, medical issues, and they need an entirely different set of amenities to help them live out their years in peace and comfort. Yeah, that was basically what I wanted to get across.
I'm just going to make a couple of comments from the chat and then go to Paul Fachinsky. But from the chat, when Steve mentioned having more than typical amounts of open space, someone says, but we don't want to be a typical American city. And someone said yes to that, which echoed some of the comments a little earlier about thinking about what made Columbia unique. Then there was some actual interesting conversations about the idea of community farms and whether you have one already with Clark's. And then there's some more conversation about aging. But I think whether Columbia needs to be typical in its or special in its open space is a big point of chat.
And that was I'm glad you brought that one up, because that was one that I caught, and I was wondering, for who made that comment, when you said what is it that you don't want to be about a typical American city related to the open space? Could you elaborate maybe a little bit on what some of those things are?
That's Bryn Conover.
Bryn, thank you.
Yeah, so I think the comment came because of the note under it was either the trends or one of the slides where it talked about the fact that Columbia does not have as much open space as some of the other master plan communities, but we do have a lot more than a typical American city. So it just concerned me to compare us to a typical American city, because I think that's hopefully one thing we can all agree on, is that that's not what we want to be. We don't want to be a typical American city. So it was really more about what is our vision and what are our objectives of what we want Columbia to be. And then I would think that open space and how we want to use that open space is going to be a big part of what we want Columbia to be in the future.
Great, thank you.
Well, along, I mean, just not to let that statement go without a little bit of digging in a little bit deeper. How, I mean, the system is robust. It's well facilitated. It's really well maintained. How do you think the open space could play a even stronger role or a more dynamic role or play a bigger role than it currently does?
So I think that a lot of the open space, the concepts behind the open space were well thought out, but I think it's a lot of it is aged, and not all of it is aged well. So I think a good example are the tot lots. There are a ton of tot lots. Are they in the right location still? Do they really have the kind of equipment that would make them attractive to new families with young kids? Are they the best use of that space? I mean, I think a lot of the concepts are still very valid, but I think rethinking some of the concepts and how those spaces are used and what's available to us now that wasn't available to us 30, 40, 50 years ago, I think would be a worthwhile discussion.
And I saw in one of the comments in the survey, the comment about making some of the playgrounds, and maybe it was tot lot space as well, more appealing to multi-generations. And that's certainly something that we see a trend in playgrounds, is that, you know, appealing to not just kids or families with kids, but that is the ability for some attractive things to multi-generations.
Well, Paul Vachinsky's been waiting a while, so.
Oh, that's okay. I enjoy the conversation. I've got two comments. The first one dealing with the 3,600 acres. While Columbia is viewed as having a lot of open space, the reality is that the open space designation in Columbia is open to interpretation. Open space in Columbia does not have the same definition and protection that is included in the Howard County Code. For example, there's an open space designation on Camelback and Oakland Mills that has a Montessori school located on it that could be changed for another use. So should Columbia use the same definition for open space as the county does in order to protect its open space? What you see is not what you necessarily get. Another area that is an issue for CA is maintaining its lakes and streams. Unfortunately, Columbia is downstream in the Howard County watershed, and rapid development in Howard County has made this maintenance problematic, even though the problem starts outside of Columbia boundaries and is not viewed as a county responsibility. Outside of Columbia, it is a county responsibility. So should there be an agreement between CA for shared responsibility, or should the county be solely responsible for maintenance of the watershed, streams, and lakes? I would pose that Ellicott City is the poster child for this problem. Thank you.
That's very important, and that I hopefully will take it up in the government section as well. Ginny Thomas.
Okay, just a few quick points. One on the number of recreation facilities that we have compared to the other communities. I thought actually we had many more. 23 pools I thought was always considered excessive compared to other communities. Second point is tot lots. The previous speaker raised some really interesting points on that, and I know I'm interested in whether we can look at some of them as intergenerational. But what CA's done, so you may want to take a look at, is a pilot study of every tot lot in Oakland Mills, with the purpose being to really see what they were built in some cases in areas where if you wanted to upgrade them, you couldn't because of where they were located. So you need to actually look at each tot lot and figure out what's workable, what isn't. Does it still continue to serve a purpose? Or can you expand the purpose? Or can you actually perhaps look at another use for that land? And that's something we've been reluctant to do, but we are doing the study of Oakland Mills. And that's almost ready to be presented, I think, Dennis, or we may have had to stop with what's been going on. But it's very interesting, the analysis they've done of our tot lots in Oakland Mills. The last thing is, I think our open space can be a double-edged sword depending on where you live. The way it was constructed, and I think in one of your slides, we were bragging about how they didn't put all the streams underground, et cetera. Well, the problem with that is we have in many places serious stream erosion because all of the water is flowing into these little streams. But when it's, you know, severe rain, it really is eroding the land and causing serious problems for people in our community. And we can't seem to figure out how to deal with it, both from just how you protect the homes or you don't, and the financial obligations. So there's two ways of looking at this, at least as far as some of the neighbors are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do want to comment on, I might have misspoke if I inferred that Columbia has less pools and community facilities than others. I went back and checked the data, and it does have the most of any of the master plan communities we looked at. So I think the comment was it's similar, but it's still more than the others and a lot more than any sort of typical, you know,
Right.
non-master plan community. You know, it's interesting you bring up the soil erosion issue. I wasn't aware of that, but it makes complete sense. And Paul, as a civil engineer, is probably all over that. But because, you know, Rouse actually saved a lot of money by keeping the storm drainage natural. But as the runoff coefficient goes up over time, Paul knows, he's nodding his head, the Q goes up, the quantity goes up, and you will start to have that. And it's very difficult to control that erosion without going in and doing major stream mitigation measures, which is quite expensive and quite destructive to the landscape. So interesting. You know, it's kind of, you get the good, the bad with the good sometimes, I guess.
Sherry, Zaret, did I click off your hand or did you take your hand down?
I think you clicked me off.
Oh, sorry. Well, so you're next.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, the points have already been made. I was also going to mention about stream erosion. And so what we're seeing is something that is a large-scale watershed effect. We're not the only community to be dealing with this. And I think ultimately it's going to need some kind of regional approach. But right now, Columbia is spending an inordinate amount of money in terms of maintenance and in terms of dredging the lakes, which is the ultimate resting place of all that erosion. Sometimes people literally do not see what open space does. And the last couple of storms that we had, my husband came home and said that there were a bunch of trees down through the open space behind our house where we walk every day. When we went out that evening to take our usual walk, the trees were gone. Open space had already been out there and had already taken everything down. So in some ways, the open space maintenance right now is almost invisible to the community. It becomes visible when we have to look at the budget and the costs of making sure that those pathways are open. And the other thing I wanted to say is that in talking about diversity, we also need to talk about wildlife diversity. And this is an area where I don't think we have done as well. There's been very little in terms of studying bird populations, amphibians, any of the deep ecology of this area. And I think we're going to have to take a look at that, because that runs almost counter to increasing density. As you have more people, you tend to have less wildlife. So we have to see how we can work out some kind of balance. And this is where the issue of growth versus sustainability is, I think, probably the most important issue we're ultimately going to have to deal with.
That is a good question, although I think there's design strategies for managing some of that that maybe we can deal with in subsequent weeks. Lyndall Egan?
Hi. In looking at our open space, we have lots of it that's very, very solitary. Long paths through deep woods connecting different neighborhoods. A lot of streams, little bridges. I walk them daily and I'm almost always alone. I oftentimes will take a walk for 45 minutes or an hour and never see another person. Is this something we should be looking at for perhaps other uses? Is there some way to, develop them so that they're used more? Or is this just a community amenity that we should enjoy in its solitude?
Question for you on that. When do you take your walks? Because is it during weekends or evenings or during the weekdays or?
Weekdays, weekends. I'm oftentimes a night walker and sometimes early days. So I've been doing this since I moved here 50 years ago.
Just because one of the patterns we see in other communities is with the increased cost of housing, more families have to be 2-income households. And so they're just not around, right, during the day. But that doesn't explain the weekends.
Yeah, no,
have you, Lynn,
yes?
wondering, have you noticed any changes in that since the COVID pandemic? And I know some of the trails near me in Baltimore that were very little used in the past have been used very heavily in the past 3 months. And I don't know if you've noticed.
Well, again, I live between two lakes and I do a lot of walking around there. The lakes are becoming more and more crowded. That's just a more accessible, maybe more interesting kind of path for a lot of people. Those are well used. And I think they're becoming more used. The paths, the deep woods paths, again, I haven't seen much. I can walk for an hour and maybe see one other person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's been consistent for years.
So it seems like some are very well used and some more solitary. So we have Brad Butler had raised his hand.
Yeah, on the comment of the paths. So you can look at the paths a couple of different ways. You can look at them as a recreational nicety, but you can also look at them as transportation infrastructure.
Right.
And the more we think of them as transportation infrastructure, the more we think of connectivity and working with the county to ensure connectivity between residential areas and commercial areas and so on and so forth. And you start to see people walking to get their groceries or biking to and from work. And then all of a sudden you can justify increased investment in facilities like that.
And the other thing, and we know Columbia and Walk Howard studies are all looking at focusing on connections, connecting gaps. A lot of times on a pathway, if there's a gap in the network, it's not as functional for someone to use like as a transportation mode. I don't know if that's the aspect, Lynn, of the paths you've been walking on. The other thing that we look at in when looking at pathways and walkways as infrastructure, or as a mode of transportation, is the actual infrastructure of the pathway is part of the equation, but for walkability, a lot of things depend on is it an interesting walk? Is there a lot of things happening along the way? do you feel safe and visible? And so some of those things might be factored in as well. But appreciate the comments.
Yeah, okay. I'll leave it.
Jessica?
Hey everyone, I just want to say real quick, our Office of Planning and Community Affairs does the annual pedestrian bicycle count program, and we have count locations throughout Columbia. And those reports are available on the CA online, and I'll also forward them to the entire group so that you can kind of see what we've counted over the last 6 years, because I think that will help this discussion in the future.
I'd like to, let me just make a little comment on, I mean, we're not trying to solve all the problems tonight. We're just trying to get them out on the table or questions. But I just note that there are strategies, and Anne is an expert in health and wellness in communities. And there are strategies for incentivizing and facilitating additional sort of pedestrian walking and activity in a community by programming and improving trails and creating destinations. And there's an old joke we used to have when we were designing pedestrian systems, and that is Americans can't walk more than 300 feet without getting bored. And so you have to figure out how to entertain them and, on trails and to help get them out there, especially when it comes to families and kids. So we can dig deeper into that as we when we come back around and start to come up with some strategies.
Lyndall Egan?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm lowering it.
Then Paul Wyszynski?
Yes, I want to comment on the paths. There's been a reluctance on the part of CA in previous years to use these as multi-use paths. The argument has been, well, there's too many conflicts. Well, as the earlier speaker said, I hardly see anybody where I walk. There really should be some consideration of using these paths in a multi-use fashion. I think we now allow electric bikes that will help older adults. There's been a lot of discussion about e-scooters, whether they should be on the paths or not. And from my standpoint, when I looked at Peachtree City, they even use these small golf carts on them for getting around as another means of transportation. Now, I do know that because Rouse took the easy way out and went up and down the hills as they were naturally formed, the grades on a lot of these paths are not very good. And I would say for older adults, in a lot of cases, they're impossible. I'm kind of thinking about the gradient that comes up from US 29 up into Oakland Mills. You got to be in good shape to be able to walk up that hill. So those are some of the downsides of our path system. Yeah, some people use them, but again, other people would probably use them more if they were a bit more accessible. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
The chat has just been confirming that lots of people see a lot of use on the path. So I think we'll have a good discussion once everyone looks at the CA counts, and we can sort of combine this together. And there are no other hands up.
Okay. It's 8:47. We were going to do a wrap up at about 8:50. So Steve, do we want to wrap there and give a preview of what our next topic, but not get into it, or do you want to try and cover it quickly?
Well, do you want to try and cover it and just see how far we get?
Yeah, let's do that. I don't think the wrap's going to take 10 minutes, so we can do that. So I'll stop sharing and you can open up again.
As we transition, this is Alan Klein. I just want to say one thing, something that overarches every one of our topics is to understand that 50 years ago and even 40 and 30 years ago, people came to Columbia to create a wonderful place. Now people come to live in a wonderful place. And so I think maybe civic engagement is the place to think about this, is that implies a very different type of civic engagement.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm struggling again
You
here.
had the pioneers 50 years ago that were very much part of it, making it happen.
Right.
Are you seeing civic engagement in full
Yes.
screen?
Yes.
Good, I figured it out for once. Um, so this covers a number of topics, and if we run out of time, we can pick back up on it. But you know, Rouse believed that there, and we have this term, and I think he uses it as well, as that is community beyond bricks and mortar, and it's not just a development; it's really a full community where people engage. We saw a really strong response here that the village centers, you know, need to continue to play a role as a people gathering place, and that needs to be reinforced. And asking is the array of concerts and activities sort of sufficient? It's kind of like, well, maybe, you know, maybe there needs to be some more thought about that. The interfaith centers were a huge innovation at the time. I was impressed by researching them and seeing how they still have a lot of activity and a lot of, they're still the center of a number of parishes and so forth, but they also, the response was kind of modest or moderate in terms of their you know, their strength of their continuing role for what that's worth. So those were sort of the, we didn't have a lot of questions on that. In terms of the data, we were very impressed to, the research shows that Columbia has a way above average arts and culture infrastructure, and that it's expressed in Howard County ranking in the top 10% of all U.S. counties in the United States in terms of providers, dollars, and government support. So, and I think, you know, one of the things we found in the research we didn't talk about was the education level in Columbia is extremely high. And so I think that's being echoed in sort of the arts and culture commitment. That's an outsider's point of view. You can correct me. And also in terms of other NPCs, it exceeds the other communities. In terms of art schools and conservatories, we just looked at this because we thought it'd be an interesting indicators. And generally, it's similar to the other master plan communities, although Reston seems to have a dearth of art schools and conservatories. And it could be that we just didn't find the information, but in terms of festivals, organized festivals and events, it seemed to be less than the other sort of benchmark master plan communities to a certain extent. It found Columbia has a slightly higher level of religious activity or commitment than some of the other of the surrounding region in the state. And again, the interfaith centers continue to play a meaningful role. I did find a survey ranking system that seemed to be fairly well researched, and it had a fun factor. And the Columbia actually ranked fairly low in terms of fun factor relative to other cities across the mid-sized cities across the country. Now, the number one was Las Vegas. So just to let you know how it starts out. But anyway, I just thought that might be of interest to, to think about or talk about. In terms of other master plan communities, other communities are basically increasing activity in their communities. They're making more of a financial commitment than they had in the past. They're also making sure they have a lot of programmable spaces and places for gathering and events. In the newer communities, there's a more innovative funding mechanism, for instance, and I'm not sure, I don't think you have this, I don't know, but they have a resale fee. In other words, every transaction that occurs in the community would pay like 1/4% that goes into a cultural development and event fund, which allows older communities, which no longer have new development throwing off fees, help supplement their funding for events. And then the other thing that's occurring is the internet platforms. And sort of the over the last decade or so, a number of communities have developed community internet platforms that are exclusive to their communities, that are highly interactive, and they become a place for organic growth, for affinity groups and clubs to grow, and it creates a higher level of inter-community kind of connectivity and activity. I don't know if Columbia has that or not, but I'm just saying that's something that we're seeing out there.
Great, thanks, Steve. We have a couple minutes for a couple quick comments. We saw in the chat bar several comments about the interfaith centers, some folks using them and seeing a value in them, the saving the religious institutions money and so forth, and then others not sure because they don't attend at one of them, don't see a lot of activity there, not sure the value they bring. Does anyone want to add a comment or anything about the interfaith centers or elaborate on some of that?
I would. Is that Alan?
Okay. Is that you, Alan?
The interfaith center, yes.
Yeah, and you are the first in line too.
Okay, thank you. The interfaith centers for me are crucial because they're part of inclusion as versus separating people. It's a way to acknowledge faith without making faith exclusive. Other two comments I wanted to make was in terms of fun factor, any of those kinds of studies, I always wonder, A, what the scale is, and B, who funded the study. So, I'm not sure we want to top the list of fun factor communities. And the other thing that in terms of, I think it's appropriate here, I think one of the things that made Rouse, separated Rouse and therefore Columbia from the rest of these classic communities is the range of people that he had helping him. It wasn't just people who knew about building houses. I mean, he had Stephen Jenks, he had others, and later he had famous sociologists. Later, my father's wasn't famous, but he was helping Rouse and Rouse's people on how do we bring community, a sense of community to Columbia. And I think I'm always looking for, anytime we're having a discussion, who's missing. And I think some of those voices may be missing these days in these kinds of discussions. Is are we bringing?
All right. I have to warn folks. We just had a power outage. The thunderstorms coming through, so we're getting Anne's cold front that she's already been enjoying, so I may disappear, so just a warning.
Well, actually, Nancy, before we lose you, Nancy McCord is the next one. Alan, you'd finished, hadn't you?
I'm done, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so Nancy. Oh, you have to unmute.
Sorry. I agree with Alan about how important the interfaith centers are. I have to say that I just spoke with some people today about it, and they left a religious community because they insisted on building their own synagogue, actually, and they stayed with the one that is located at the meeting house. I think it gives a broader sense of community. I agree that it also creates more inclusion. The closer we are to others, the more we are bound to learn from them and get to know them and not be estranged. And I think that's the whole idea, is to bring people together. And I hope that we don't lose that concept amongst
I have a question
others.
on that. I have a question on that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When you say there's inclusion and there's also more sort of interaction, engagement between different groups, I'm curious about how that happens, because I just kind of visualize it as a space where different groups kind of come and go and do their own thing, but don't really engage with each other. So is there actually some engagement with each other with these different groups?
I think there is. I know I've spoken to one person who's the leader of a Jewish community, and he said that everybody's siloed. And I've spoken to other people who have said that's not true at all. And I've been to events where there were Muslims, Christians, and Jews together in one large meeting. I think that in order to function in the building, they need to communicate, which is one positive aspect of it, and learn to share and use the space. I mean, they don't all use it at the same time, and they don't all sit together and meet together, but there is a lot more conversation and a lot more community than if they were in separate buildings.
Great. It's almost 9 o'clock. I know the chat questions and comments they'll be recorded and we could print them out, so we'll keep them. I think this was great discussion. Obviously, you could see our challenge with getting so much information into a 2-hour session. So that's the reason for the multiple sessions on these. We'll be recording I'll be cleaning up my notes, especially the parts when the lights went out and I had my fingers on the wrong part of the keyboard. And we'll be combining the chat comments as well. And then our next workshop is August 18th. So it'd be the same time, the same setup with if everyone could log on at about 6:45 just so we could get all the kinks worked out and start on time. That would be great. I think if anyone had any direct comments or other things, Kristen, send them to you. Is that correct? You'll get them to our team.
Yeah, I'll be the distribution point.
Clearinghouse. Okay, great. And as I said, we'll be going through the survey in more detail, some of those responses, and that will be informing some of the material we present the next time. But again, Erin will be presenting the housing market study, and we'll be getting into focused discussion on housing and neighborhood revitalization, neighborhood conservation, and design and architectural excellence at the next session.
If you, I mean, this process is for you. If you have any suggestions on how we're formatting things and sort of managing this valuable time, feel free to share with Kristen and she'll pass on to us.
Yeah, that would be great. So this was with us being our first session, it was a good way to see how we worked out some of the hand raise and the chat and some of the discussions. So we'll be able to fine tune that a little bit for the next time as well.
But I think we're using technology to osmosis.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you all. We
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable.
Yes.
Okay.